The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.
Tonight, how a group of Ontario youth are fighting back against racism. Then, Steve Paikin in conversation with academic Wendy H. Wong about her new book, We, the Data, Human Rights in the Digital Age. That's ahead on The Agenda. Canada has long celebrated its diversity and multiculturalism, but despite this being a well-admired aspect of Canadian society, racism still exists today. In response, organizations have established across the country to support diaspora communities, and young people from those communities are also getting involved. And we are pleased to welcome people from two of those organizations who are part of that fight. They are Executive Director Eleanor Yang and Youth Leader Ellie Leong of the Chinese Canadian National Council Toronto chapter, and Youth Leader Avani Parthapan and Executive Director Neithan Chan of Tamil Civic Action. Welcome to all four of you for joining us in studio. Eleanor, I'm going to come to you first. Help us understand what your organization does.
Yeah, so at the Chinese Canadian National Council Toronto chapter, a little bit of a mouthful, CCN-CTO for short, we support low-income, working-class Chinese Canadian immigrants, refugees, newcomers. So we do a lot of capacity building in the community, including with youth, including with seniors and workers. So they're the main demographic we serve. We're based in Scarborough, but we work across the GTA.
All right, and Neithan, Tamil Civic Action.
So Tamil Civic Action is an organization looking at social, political, economic, and cultural empowerment of Tamil Canadians, particularly by engaging the young people in supporting that work, particularly to remove the barriers that we experience in getting to that empowerment, getting to the success, and so on.
All right, Eleanor, you had mentioned these youth workshops,
Yes.
Working with youth. They're bringing different organizations together. Tell me, why did you feel that that's an important thing to do?
Yeah, I think youth often feel a little powerless, a little voiceless in a lot of civic engagement. And so a huge way we're able to support adults, workers, seniors is by using youth and using their advocacy, their leadership to bring other folks in. So we have a lot of seniors at CCN-CTO we work with who wouldn't otherwise feel that it's their place maybe to even address injustice or connect with community, but youth are able to create such inclusive spaces where when we work with Tamil Civic Action, we have interpretation, we have translated materials, we have youth who look like their grandchildren supporting them and guiding them. And we see a lot of seniors that way feel more like they need to take more initiative to take change, create change. They can vote. They actually can create change in support of youth. So we see them as a key piece of that intergenerational aspect of learning culture from seniors, learning about experiences from seniors, but also teaching what they know and teaching values of multiculturalism, of diversity, of respect for folks we live with, and of creating change in their community.
All right, well, I think it's important that we talk to the youth. So that's why I'm going to come to you. Ellie, first, what grade are you at?
I'm in grade 10.
All right, what do you like to do? What are your interests?
Well, in my free time, I really like reading. I like listening to music, just like all the other folks out there. I'm really interested in any way of like law, international law, diplomacy. That's why I'm also working with CCN-CTO.
Okay. Avani, how about you?
I'm in grade 10 as well. I go to high school in Oshawa, and I also love reading. I love listening to music, and I have a high interest in law as well and psychology. And I also like writing, and I like writing speeches as well.
Okay, I think we're in good hands here, it feels like. All right. Ellie, I'm just curious, when did you get involved with the organizations?
So I think I got involved around a year ago, and that was when I started grade 9 year, and I thought that our school doesn't really have much about advocacy, so I should just reach out myself to try to be in touch with more of my community and also do more social work.
Was it a particular sort of thing that happened that you said, I want to get involved? Was there, obviously you said there was nothing there, there was space for you to do some advocacy work, but was there a particular incident or something that happened that you're like, you know what, we need to do better?
I think it was more an experience, I think, generally, because I also am Chinese immigrant, so I feel more connected to these issues. And I feel like if I not having too many problems, but I see that my grandparents, my parents may be having problems. Then what about the people who don't speak English? What about the people who don't have as many resources, not as technically able as us? So I thought that it'd be a great way for me to help my community, help my people, and also try to connect with my culture more.
Okay. Anthony, how about you? When did you get involved with Tamil Civic Action?
So I think it was in grade 8 when I first was in tune with what was happening in my community and how people in my community were struggling from these barriers and racism in general. But I connected with Nathan Sean when I was about 2.5, I think.
Okay.
It was from my mom. My mom was, I think, a close friend with Nathan Sean. And then as I grew up, I was also I would help during the election. When I was in middle school, I would help with data management and everything.
Wow.
And then I found out about TCA in grade 8, and then I went to workshops, and I realized that was something I enjoyed. And then in grade 9, I found out about ARAH and TCA and how they were both combining, and I decided it would be a great opportunity for me to help my community, because I want to do that in the future. I want to be an ambassador for my Tamil community and other communities as well. And,
I was just curious, you had mentioned you attended these workshops, and now you're leading some of these workshops. Tell me sort of what made you want to do that, and what's kind of the role that kind of looks like.
So I've always had an interest in public speaking. I would do many speeches for mostly Neil and Sean, but and I guess now I really wanted to do more of that, because as elections pass, you don't get that much opportunity to do public speaking. So now in these workshops, I get to educate people, actually, instead of just speaking on a podium. I get to collaborate with other people, and I get to put in my own creativity and my own ideas, and I really enjoy that. And I also always had an interest in racism, and I thought that I didn't understand it as much as I would in middle school. I always thought that I had this lack of understanding. And then now in grade 9 in high school, I learned more about it as I lead workshops. And I guess that's how, once I've developed this understanding, I found that I could lead better in workshops.
Okay. I am curious if you can build on that. What does these workshops look like? If someone is attending this workshop, what is it that they're going to hear from you?
They're going to hear also from the coordinators and youth. They're going to hear about we do activities, so these fun, engaging activities that also educate them about racism, and at the same time we do case studies, so we incorporate real life scenarios that may take place in your daily life, and then we give them discussion questions and incorporate group work as well with the audience, and it's really fun in my opinion, and it's at the same time, the fact that they're learning something new from how engaging this whole workshop is, it really fascinates me. And every time I get to lead in these workshops, it's I was so used to only being participating in these workshops, but now as I lead them, realize how it is to be in the shoes of those who lead, and it's fun both ways.
All right. I want to do a little bit of a history lesson to better understand sort of how the organizations came to be. So with the CCNCTO, what's the backstory of how the organization came to?
Yeah, so we were founded in 1980 as a result of, misinformation in media, actually. It was CTV W5's campus giveaway episode, which talked about foreign students stealing spots from Canadian students. And, when they investigated this issue, they found that it was complete misinformation because these were actually Chinese-Canadian students. And so the Chinese-Canadian community came together across Canada to call this misinformation out, to address racism, and to spread public awareness that we are Canadian. In 1985, we became incorporated as a nonprofit, and since then we've been really focusing on Toronto local change, and since then we've expanded to support more youth, really support not just capacity building, but leadership, engage folks in civic engagement. A lot of community members like youth can't vote. And, as Avani said, elections roll around once every couple of years. So to feel your voice is only heard every couple of years is very unfair, especially for folks. We represent a lot of folks with precarious immigration status. So for folks with PR even, where you can't vote, we need to make our voices heard, and we need to create local change that really, supports the benefit of everyone.
All right. Neither Tamil Civic Action. Look, three of us Tamils right here. We can talk about sort of, the issues back home, but sort of how did the organization get its footing here?
It's connected because, Tamil youth have been facing quite a bit of challenges here in terms of, discrimination, racial profiling. But despite many of those challenges, they've made it into many spaces. We see you here as hosting the show and anchoring it. But there's always been a bit of a two-part to their lives. The organization that helped back home, quote unquote back home, was separate from organizations that were doing work for local issues here. There was no space for us to connect how that connects to us here and to be able to do that work. So Tamil Civic Action came out of that need. You could actually be able to have a space where you are actually helping with the human rights situation and for, getting recognition for the genocide that took place and advocating for justice. But you can also be a youth worker or supporting seniors here and to not to differentiate. And then they were able to see how the struggles of diaspora around migration and racial profiling connects to indigenous struggles here and how it connects to anti-black racism and how to confront anti-black racism. And so this space was needed for us to be kind of feel complete ourselves in that. So we have hundreds of volunteers like many others, who have come in. And now that we have a formal space, we've been doing it in ad hoc here and there. But this space actually opened up door for many young professionals, young adults, but also multi-generational collaboration to address the issues. Because it's not, sometimes you're told, you are here, forget about what's happening in your homeland, as if, you could separate that. And sometimes the people who work here are not fully aware of what's going on. So it's that space that's made it successful. We've been operating since 2019, so it's been going really well.
All right. Eleanor, you had talked about headlines, and I'm curious, there's a long history of anti-Asian racism, and it seems to rear its ugly head when there's something going on in the world. Obviously, we don't have to go that far with COVID. We saw this with SARS as well. Anytime there's some politically tense moments. How do you manage through these waves, and how do you kind of work with members of your organization to kind of see the other side and also be hopeful and fight through it?
I think that's the key of public education. Throughout COVID-19, we did connect with folks who experienced racism, hate, discrimination. And a key thing that we found was that everyone wanted more public education. No one was calling for retribution. Folks were asking to educate our community members, let folks know we are Canadian. And part of that includes solidarity work, recognizing who lives in your community, connecting with those folks, seeing our shared experiences, and working together to combat oppression, systemic oppression that harms both of us, maybe in different ways, but nonetheless harms both of us. So public education has been a key way we've connected with folks. And I think a lot of Chinese Canadians, including folks like myself who grew up here, we don't always see progressive Chinese Canadian spaces where we can talk about those who experience the most, precarity. We don't talk about low-wage Chinese workers in factories or in restaurants and grocery stores. We don't necessarily see that representation. We also don't always see representation of solidarity work with, Chinese community members unlearning biases, right? And so I think that's a key space we're in, and where we're able to engage youth in that work and then engage their parents, engage their family, have those conversations in different languages. I think we've been able to create a lot of change within our community as well to recognize that, systemic anti-Asian racism is a thing. We're going to continue to see that. And that's why we need to educate other folks, but we also need to educate ourselves, because systemic anti-Asian racism is within the same, branch of systemic racism that impacts, Black folks, Indigenous folks, Indian folks, and now when we see rising xenophobia. So I think that's a key realization for us.
Okay. Ellie, the reality is that these organizations are still very much needed. The work that Eleanor has talked about. Help me understand, how do you define success? What is success for you when you're done a workshop or just having a conversation with family? How do you kind of measure success?
Yeah, so we can't define success with comparisons, obviously. It's not about the numbers, not about how many people that we are able to affect, not about how many people we're able to educate, but about, I think, self-fulfillment, how we feel in this community. And I think before there's this really big misconception that you have to create a significant amount of change for it to count as change, or for many people to maybe say their thanks to you for it to be some sort of social work. But I think through this work, I've recognized that it's more about how we treat each other. It's about the person that we're helping and them feeling that they are being helped, that is successful work for us. So we will try, obviously, to continue to foster those connections, and that is definitely how we define success.
Is there a story that sits with you of someone that you've worked with, or a story that you're like, we've done something here, we've made some change?
I think I've been through a lot of workshops. I think it's been 30 and counting, if I'm correct. Okay. So there's a lot of more individual stories about that, but I think one that stands out to me is more the historical part of it. Because right now we see so many social movements. We see like a specific month too, this month as Asian Awareness Month and all that. But people don't understand why things exist. People think that this is too much. It's like, we don't know why we need an entire month to celebrate a heritage. But through very recent workshops, especially the ones where we discuss more about case studies, we were able to teach people the significance of the history of Chinese Canadians and how we've evolved from there. And appreciating that history has been a really great success for all of us.
Anthony, same question to you. In terms of success, how would you define success?
I think also that numbers don't matter, and all that matters is, like, it doesn't even matter how many people you educate, like Ellie said. It's more about how you feel after you've managed to educate, like how many people it could have been. Even if it was one person, like as long as that's a change you've caused is beneficial, or if it had a good impact on that person. For me, that's like the biggest success I could have. I think like when I've been doing these workshops, it's like after the workshop's over, it's usually like all of these people that have come to that workshop, and the fact that they have been so intrigued while doing this workshop, and how much we as youth, like we're probably the same age as this audience, and we've taught them so much. It's like, it's the best feeling ever, I think. And like, that's what I think success is to me.
Neithan, there are sometimes tensions within groups. You can look at the headlines over the last couple of years. We know, with what's happening in the Middle East, what's happening at the borders of India and Pakistan, there are always politically tense subjects that you need to avoid to make sure everyone is working towards the common cause. How does one do that?
Well, I think avoid is maybe a stronger term. I would say, there are sometimes we are forced to avoid certain things when we don't need to. As well. Like, for example, we have fled a genocide as Tamil community, and it's still happening. So if a school tells our young people, you're here, avoid that conversation. For them, it feels like they're not being valued. Their full authentic self is not being brought into the structure, right? So for them, because they're hearing it at home, their parents, grandparents might be still living in those situations. And the memorial, Brampton opened a genocide memorial, a monument. So it is close to heart. So I think the important thing is to have the tools and the awareness as to how to have some of these conversations in a respectful way. What are some guiding principles that guides this conversation? Are we talking about fairness? Are we talking about valuing different perspectives and so on? I do think that within some context, when we work as South Asian communities together, it is hundreds of different cultures and, many hundreds of languages and so on. Sometimes we have to remind people what the root causes some of our struggles are, whether it be colonialism, whether it be, white supremacy, whether it be, a discrimination at workplace. So sometimes we do tend to focus on this is the issue at hand, so let's focus on that. So it's prioritizing sometimes, but not necessarily to say you need to fully avoid it. I do think that a lot of us are not prepared. And sometimes when you're not fully prepared, it might make sense to avoid it until you're prepared, but not avoid it all the time. When we talk about racism, one of the racism that we face as Asian communities is that there's a lot of erasure. We are not seen in the media, our stories are not covered, our full picture is not being shared. We are often, kind of stereotyped to have quote-unquote model minority kind of things where our issues are not being discussed. And so I see that as also a part of avoidance in a way, right? So you're right. We need to be ready to have those conversations, but it's a part of the process that we need to commit. So I think we're making progress as an organization that has rooted history and fleeing a genocide. We want to make sure that our people around us see us for who we are, but they also see our experience and understand our experience.
All right, I'll get Eleanor to chime in. And I'm curious, are there any politically tense subjects that you need to avoid?
I'm going to agree with Neithan. We don't necessarily avoid anything. I think something at CCN CTO we focus on is building folks capacity to ask critical questions. So when I can recognize racism that I've experienced, I'm able to then ask critical questions about racism other folks experience and think about what the underlying factors of that are. So we never necessarily avoid topics, and I do know it can be hard to handle topics sometimes, especially when folks come into a workshop, for example, with different levels of knowledge. But I think that's where it's great to see folks who've been long-standing part of this work ask questions to other participants, even when they're not facilitating a workshop. That's where key components of like case studies or group work can be really helpful. I think we've taught our community members to really question what justice is, that the law is not always just, and that's why laws change as well. And so I think when they can recognize global conflicts and recognize oppression globally, they can also relate to that, and we can fight, underlying factors for all of that together. So like systemic racism, white supremacy, colonialism, imperialism, all of that.
Yeah. I'll say one thing quickly. What we need to avoid is trying to find solutions right away or trying to solve things. We cannot pretend like we'll have solution in the same workshop for a conflict that has existed.
Right.
So in order for us to avoid jumping to that step, it's important for us to kind of say, let the process continue, but are we learning better? Are we doing better in connecting with each other?
All right, talking about,
sorry,
go
as
ahead.
well about that is that instead of avoiding, I think that's where our space is very important, where folks can feel like they can learn, they can ask questions that may be incorrect, they can then be educated, they can then take materials away from these workshops and continue learning on their own time or educating their friends. I think there aren't many spaces where folks feel safe to make mistakes like that, especially safe to make mistakes with translated materials, interpretation available to you. So instead of avoiding things because we don't feel comfortable or don't feel educated enough, we're never going to feel educated enough to speak about every single issue. That's where these spaces are very important.
Okay, I wanted to pick up on that note of connection, Ellie. As young people, what are some of your biggest challenges in getting your peers involved?
I think right now there's a rise in collectivism, especially with social media. So getting involved, yes, a lot of people are involved in a lot of different things, but in what things specifically? I think right now we have a tendency to follow along to trends and not speak up against things. And it's really easy for us, especially people who are chronically online, like myself, to be really easily influenced by wrong ideas or by certain views that we might not agree with if we dive in a bit deeper. So I think our biggest problem in terms of connecting people is having them have the courage to step outside of their safe zone and to connect with different sort of people instead of just staying to their own circles.
All right. Adani, same question. Seems like a like and a share is not going to do enough. It might do a little bit, but there's more work there. What are some of the challenges in getting your peers involved?
I feel like also social media has had a great influence on like the community of the youth, and there's a lot of false information on social media as well, and this can create false ideas for the youth as well, like Ellie said. And I feel like the hardest part to get youth involved is not only that they don't have the courage to, but maybe they think that these problems are like they don't need their voice to be like heard. They maybe like it's already been taken care of, or maybe there's other like maybe organizations like ours, they're already doing their part, and that they don't really need to like they find probably no point in stepping up. But we like our job is to encourage people to do like to have their voice be heard, because maybe they don't understand how important this is and how there is hope to decrease the impact of racism. And I feel like social media has definitely been a barrier to this. And maybe they think that they only can share their voice through social media, and because there's a lot of people on social media,
right.
And it's probably one of a very large community. And but as I said, false information is always spreading. So I feel like the hardest part is to make them understand how much their voice could be to have an impact.
I am curious, how has this experience, attending the workshops, but now kind of running them, has sort of changed your view of the world?
I feel like for me, leading workshops has been an incredible experience. But it is definitely before I said that I've never been in touch with the topic of racism in general, and I've always thought that my lack of understanding would never lead me to where I am today, leading these workshops. But as I've been going through collaborating with other people who have had the same experiences as me, and learning from other people like audience who have also had the same experiences, I've definitely grown a larger perspective, and as well as my parents who have also been through similar like experiences, especially through immigration and having trouble in back home countries and like all the hardships they've been through. I've come to understand more of how much struggles they've had to go through to raise me and to lead me to where I am today. And I've also understood like my other relatives and how they've come to this country, and how like the youth could like how much the youth's voice could have such an impact on letting other youth know that like our society and our families are going through these kind of stuff, and I've understood this importance.
Okay. Ellie, I'm curious, you talked about the history, which is a very important part of understanding where to go forward, but how has this experience changed your view of the world?
I think, admittedly, before I've been very ignorant about such issues, because you don't really care about things until you're the minority of the issue and you're the victims of it. And so before, I feel like I've been very blindsided by certain things. I feel like even though I see a lot of advertisements about anti-racism or maybe poverty or any other global issues, I think that there's always been a distance between me and the issue. It doesn't concern me, so why would I care? But I think now, dipping my toes into social work, I don't think I can ever just not care anymore. Knowing about all this and being so close to it, I can't just ignore it anymore. Whether it is passively or actively, like donating or maybe actively like doing such workshops, it's made me feel that our voice is really loud, actually. And if more people were able to connect themselves on a more personal and emotional level, perhaps our issues wouldn't exist anymore.
Eleanor, you must be proud just hearing this, like just to know that that the young people have this under control, that there's some hope there. I am curious though, what would you like to tell others who are just learning about all of this for the first time? You don't know where they've been, but this is the first time that they've, are understanding sort of the experiences, whether you are from the Asian community or from other communities. Where do you go?
Yeah, I think for me, it's important for folks to know that change comes from the bottom up. So I think you can easily feel helpless as one individual who cares about an issue, or one individual who feels voiceless because, I can't vote in this next election. But I think when people come together, when we unite, our power is so strong. I think when youth talk about issues, we can create local change. Local change snowballs into national change, into global change. And I think that's the key part. Any sort of change, starting on a small scale, impacting one person, changing one person's perspective, can have a butterfly effect and create so much positive benefit to everyone.
All right. We have a couple of minutes left. I want to go around the table. As we mentioned, May is Asian Heritage Month. Neithan, what does it mean to you?
Well, I think it means that we are being acknowledged, we are being valued, our contribution is being seen, and I want to say this, a lot of the times Heritage Months tend to be celebrated with food, dance, and music and so on. This should be a month where we actually look at social, political, cultural, and economic contribution, both in Canada, but also over centuries and over millenniums to the world. Because a lot of what we study in our schools come from Asian communities, but not often footnoted to say this is where it's coming from. So that acknowledgement needs to be there. It also should be a month where people focus to address barriers. Asian communities face barriers, so this month means committing to acknowledging racism exists, acknowledging that racism exists in multiple ways, including systemic racism, and committing ourselves to say, this month while we celebrate, we also want to make sure we commit to changing those situations around us and removing the barriers.
All right. Anthony?
I also think that, Asian Heritage Month is mostly around like dances and food and celebration in general. Yeah, it's important to recognize the struggles that our Asians have been going through, and I hope that people learn more about the contributions that Tamil people, Asians in general, have contributed. For example, people like Neithan Chan and people like Eleanor, who have done so much to have this impact on the society in general, and it's important to share these stories, especially during this month, even though I wish that we could be as much recognition we are getting during this month as I wish that we get throughout the year. But having a month dedicated to the Asians, which is an umbrella term, but Asians in general, like, is very heartwarming, and I feel it's very important because we do have Tamil Genocide Month as well, but like celebrating this whole community in 1 month and what they've been facing and what we can do to help like lift people up and to share experiences together. I feel like this is this month is important for that, and it's definitely a good cause.
All right. Ellie, what does it mean to you?
I think more about what it means to me, it's like more about what I hope the legacy of it will be. Asian Heritage Month is obviously a month where we celebrate Asians, and obviously, as what previously mentioned as well, it's also about the social, political, and every other aspect of it. But I hope that it's more about bringing awareness to different households that, hey, look at your calendar. There's Asian Heritage Month. There are communities of Asian people around you. And this awareness can bring them to do more work throughout the year and even years onward.
All right, Eleanor, you get the last word.
Yeah, I echo everyone. I think for Asian Heritage Month, it's important to think about those who we don't often think about. I think we can easily highlight, influential figures who everyone can recognize, but I think it's also important to think about, folks who worked on the front lines during COVID-19. I think it's important to think about agricultural workers, personal support workers, nurses, things like that, where we might not recognize Asian labor there. I also think, in addition to, for Asian folks, we also need to educate ourselves about, again, Asian is an umbrella term, other communities' experiences. So not necessarily just taking this month for ourselves and saying, oh, everyone's celebrating us, let's celebrate with food and culture, but also recognizing and unlearning biases we have in our communities as well, recognizing privilege where we have privilege, I think is very important.
All right, we're going to leave it there. Ethan, Adani, Eleanor, Ellie, thank you so much for sharing your experiences and your work. Really appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
In the book, We the Data, Human Rights in the Digital Age, author Wendy H. Wong makes the case that the collection and tracking of our data by big tech comes at a cost to our humanity. She's a professor of political science and principals research chair at the University of British Columbia, and her book recently won the 2024 Balsillie Prize for Public Policy. And she joins us on the line now from Kelowna, British Columbia. And Wendy, I guess congratulations are in order for starters, so well done, and thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
I want to ask you off the top here, you keep using a term referring to data, which I haven't heard before, and so I needed a little explanation of what it means. You say data are sticky. What does that mean?
I really mean like gum at the bottom of your shoe, how it gets stuck and really crammed in there, because we often don't know that the gum has been stepped on until it's too late. So this is kind of how I think about data about people as well, which is that we're living our lives, we're doing our thing with our devices and trying to coordinate our activities. And this whole time we are creating data, and those data are about things that are everyday. They're not necessarily extraordinary. Those data can endure for a long time. They're used across all kinds of different other analytical databases. And it's a process that we are involved in, but we're not the only ones involved, right? There are these companies most of the time which are actually interested in collecting those data. So I talk about the stickiness also as co-creation, because it's not just about what we individually choose to do.
Now, you said data and I said data. Do you know which one is right?
I think we're both right.
Okay. Well, let's just pack up and go home right now then. That's a good...
I think we solved it. We fixed it.
No, we do have more things to discuss here. Datification, however you want to pronounce it. That's another term you use. What does that mean?
It really just means how our lives are really becoming very much both analog and digital. So it's really hard to separate the difference between what you're doing physically versus what's being recorded or analyzed about you digitally. And so it's sort of thinking about life as both digital and physical. The other way to really define it, as others have done, is to say that a lot of human behaviors have become digital data, right? Stored in a database somewhere for analysis by a computer or human being.
Let's do an excerpt from the book here, and this is right off the top where you talk about Ring, this thing where you can look into your phone and see a camera that takes a picture of your front door or whatever. And here we go. Sheldon, you want to bring this graphic up here? The video doorbell, it seemed, was the answer to the new problems created by online commerce and the solution to answering the doorbell when multiple packages arrive throughout the day. But video doorbells are not the only digital devices made for our convenience or increased productivity. There are also smartphones, smart thermostats, smart TVs, smart speakers, smart refrigerators, you name it. These smart devices form the ecosystem of the Internet of Things and have fundamentally changed many aspects of our lives and perhaps even who we are. Okay, I got to ask you about that last line. They've changed who we are, meaning what?
Meaning, humans have since they've figured out how to write things down, we've kept records about people and events for a very long time. So this is not a new technology. But what digital devices, so the ones that you just read out of the excerpt, those are all kinds of things that are in our everyday, that are tracking our behaviors, that are monitoring what we're doing, and also operating as a result of the sort of analysis that are provided by the data that are created. So this way that we can track people's activities, we can create data about what we're doing and what we're thinking on a second-by-second basis. This is new. This is fundamentally a big shift from how we used to live our lives, not just, comparing centuries ago, but I'm thinking even 20 years ago, before the advent of what's called big data, right, where we had all this information from all these new sensors we were putting into our devices, whether that's phones, cameras, refrigerators, cars, you name it, any sort of digital technology that's out there has really become a data collection device as well.
Well, you go broader. You say it's actually come under the category of human rights now, not necessarily the kind of human rights we think of as in, the right not to suffer harm or the right not to be discriminated against, but a different kind of human rights. What do you mean by that?
A lot of the conversation, I think, around AI, and especially around data, have really revolved around this idea of privacy, which is one of many human rights, and it's an important human right for sure. But I think when we limit our conversation to particular human rights, like privacy or like freedom of expression, what we're doing is really limiting the way that we think about how the practice of data collection and datification has really changed the way we live. And so I sort of zoom back. I like to think about, what it is that human rights were created for. And so in the 1940s, after World War II, the world came up with this list of rights, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And the values they were based on were the values of autonomy, dignity, equality, and what they called brotherhood at the time, which I think in 2025, we're calling that something like community, right? So what it means to live as an individual among other human beings while protecting or trying to balance these various values that really underlie, the things that we care about, like privacy, like freedom of expression, like freedom from discrimination, as you said.
But are we vigilant enough? Are we energized enough as a community to care about this, or perhaps more likely too complacent to worry about it because we just love the convenience and fun of it all?
I think everyone's different. But one of the things I think is really difficult is when you say, this is a privacy issue, let's say AI is a privacy issue. People often think, well, I'm not doing anything wrong, so people can have the data, right? And I think that really is a conversation stopper. I think it's more the ideas behind autonomy, dignity, equality, and community, why I focus on these big ideas, is because we're all affected by some change in our lives. Like, I often talk to people who are really worried about whether they have choice or not. Can I actually opt out of datification? I mean, the short answer is not really, and not easily, because it's not just about what you're doing and what you're consenting to, but what others are consenting to, what companies and governments are doing as a matter of business or as a matter of government. They're using these digital systems as well. So it's really hard to say, to exercise one's autonomy, for example, in the digital age.
I'm going to come at this again, though, because, I've interviewed a lot of people on this program, experts such as yourself, who, I get the sense they're trying to energize the public to caring a lot about this because they are concerned about the infringements on our privacy and the loss of human rights as a result of what's going on right now. And yet the public just doesn't seem to care. They love the fun and the convenience and are prepared to give up their privacy to do so. Are you frustrated by that?
I am not frustrated per se. I think I am I think people have not been told about this trade-off, right? I think sometimes there's a way that people say, oh, well, we've traded off our privacy for convenience. And I think if we'd actually known that was happening, looking back a decade or a decade and a half ago, I think people would have responded differently. I think now we're sort of it's a little late in the evolution of technological devices that are very much embedded in our lives. Again, this is why datification is such a prominent theme in society. But I also think that it's more important now to try to come up with rules that actually make sense for people, as opposed to lining up behind, existing lines of argument that I think have been very important, but have reached resistance. I mean, there are people who simply think that privacy is dead. I don't think that, but I think privacy has changed. I think the importance of privacy is still there. We still want to preserve a space for our own thoughts and our own abilities to make decisions freely. I think that's very important, but then we should be talking about it from my view, from a point of view of autonomy, of equality. Does everyone get the same choices? Are we making choices for ourselves or a broader space, a broader community of people?
You almost seem to be hinting at a kind of a class war here. Am I reading that right?
No. I mean, it's not, I don't think of it as a class war. I definitely think that AI, as many people have found, magnify differences between people. But let me just give you a current example. So, it seems like every time I talk about this, there's something new that happens that I can really talk through. So 23andMe declared bankruptcy about a month and a half ago. And a lot of people, rightfully so, we're really worried about being in that database now that the company is going under, and who knows what could happen to those data once the final sale or breakup of that company happens. But that's a case I talk about a lot in the book prior to this announcement of bankruptcy, precisely because if you've entered that database, if you've done the spit test, you've not only entered it for yourself, but for everyone related to you, because DNA are inherently shared. They are, a co-created form of data that we maybe don't think about in those words. But certainly everybody understands family resemblances. And I know that most people entered that data set, maybe not to find out about diseases per se, or genetic disorders, but to find out who they might be related to and where their genetic heritage comes from. That's fun. But it also has now come at this sort of conundrum, this price that we probably didn't think about before we chose to do the spit test.
That is a concerning example, but let me give you the other side of the coin. And again, we'll go back to Ring, the example we talked about off the top, where you can look at your cell phone and there's a camera at your front door, and you can presumably feel a little safer about who's on your property or who's leaving what at your front door in exchange for giving up some privacy rights. Now, that seems to be a trade that a lot of people are prepared to make. You okay with that?
It's important to point out whose privacy we're talking about, or whose data, right? So yes, if you are the Ring doorbell owner, you have, you've presumably thought about what could happen if you're recording things at your front door. But then we have to ask, does everyone who delivers a package to your door consent? Does everyone who visits you in front of that camera consent? And I think even less explicitly, it's the people who walk in front of your house. Right? Everyone who passes by that camera, including cars and people and dogs and whatever, children, they're all going to be part of a digital data set now, accessible through your app. We cannot actually make that decision for other people. And I think that is something that has come up now. I know some people living in, stratas, that has come up, because people living in the strata don't want to, or do not feel it's right to not consent to that kind of addition to one's house. And so on the one hand, it's about the property owner, the Ring doorbell owner. On the other hand, it's about the community in which that person or that household lives.
This is hardly a new subject. It was almost 80 years ago that George Orwell warned us about this in 1984, the surveillance state and all of that business. But I guess for a lot of people, it feels right now like we are neck deep in this, and it's almost past the point of no return to reverse any of this. Do you agree?
So given my background in looking at human rights activists and what they do in the world, and also looking at various social movements, there's never a good time for norm change, for social change, for political change. And so you could tell the folks who started the human rights regime, that I referred to in the 1940s, was it too late? I mean, we just experienced the Holocaust. There were lots and lots of things that governments are doing to people that we think of now as unacceptable or as torture, that back then were part of political activity. So in that sense, no, I think that the realization that it's not just about government surveilling. I think, it's about the fact that we actually have companies who are doing the work of the data collection, companies that are investing resources into developing AI systems that could better evaluate and analyze those data. It's not about the state versus individuals and communities now. I think it's also about how companies and their products have really enmeshed themselves in our lives, for good and for what I would say is at least worrying, and something that we should be talking about more explicitly, rather than saying, oh, this is just about privacy, or this is an AI issue. I think it's really a data issue.
Sure, but if you're on the internet, you're presumably there forever. And I presume you believe we have the right to be forgotten. The question is, can we get from there to here?
I mean, yes, people do presume that I think the right to be forgotten is an important right. I think the sort of the impetus behind that right is that we should have a choice as to whether we are digitized or not. But the right to be forgotten is exercised after data have already been created. And that's my number one sort of caveat around that right, which is I think that the step should actually be before the data are actually in existence to be forgotten or to be erased. We should actually be very mindful, we meaning people, we meaning governments, should be doing things to set guardrails for what types of data ought never to be collected, or to be collected and then properly disposed of, if that's possible. I hint at in the book that might not be possible. Data are really hard to track. But right now, I do think that, I think it's really important to think about how whether data should exist or not, what types of human data should exist, and then set the proper guardrails around protecting our rights. Like, when is it that the existence of data actually threatens our ability to exercise our rights that already exist?
Well, to follow up on that, we're trying to figure out who the bad guy is here. And if you read 1984, it's the surveillance state. But today, is the surveillance state the biggest threat to our privacy and our human rights, in your view?
I mean, I think there are multiple. If you were to rewrite George Orwell's book, I think there are multiple parties to be concerned with, and a lot of times we call that other party, besides the state, we call that party big tech. And I think that describes a certain set of companies that are very powerful. They drive the global economy, and they really underwrite the way that we live our lives today in terms of providing just the basic technologies that enable all kinds of human interactions and exchanges. So I don't know if it's not that anyone's bad per se, but I think that as a political scientist, one of the things that I worry about is a disproportionate or unequal distribution of power in society. When one or more actors become so much more powerful than other groups or individuals in society, that's what human rights were set up for, was to guard against the excesses of the state. And I think now we need to think about how we might want to preserve some of those key values that human rights were trying to protect, when now we have, big tech, digital companies also making incursions into the way that humans experience their lives.
Wendy, let's go back to first principles here for a second. And I'm sure you remember an occasion where I think it was Mark Zuckerberg who was testifying before a Senate committee in Washington, and an octogenarian senator looked at him and clearly didn't know anything about Facebook, because he said, this is free, right? How do you possibly make any money when this is free? I think most people understand now how they make money despite the fact that it's free. But let's go there. Let's follow up. How do they make so much money out of knowing, for example, that I like to go to the local ice cream store at 8 o'clock on a Wednesday night for a cone before heading home?
I mean, there's a huge data market. and this is why it's not just what we experience. It's not just these devices I focus a lot of attention on in the book. It's also just the way we're living. I mean, people create products, they create services, they improve what they're doing based on what they can ascertain from the patterns of behavior that people leave behind through these digital data traces. And so I think it's that, we wonder how much money there is, but there's an enormous amount of money in that, right? In the sale and exchange of data. And so one of the things that I think people really struggle with is if you regulate data, what's going to happen to these very powerful, very rich companies that have made a lot of money in the exchange of data? And my rejoinder to that is always, these are very clever people who have come up with innovative products that have fundamentally changed how we live. And if we give them more regulations or more restrictions, I don't have so much doubt about their capacities to work through different types of restrictions on the use of data. I think that's exactly, you're asking the right question. And at the same, it's hard to imagine that data could be so valuable, but they are, right? They are. And people have called data the new oil, for example. We also tend to think about data as detritus or exhaust. So we have this very bifurcated and conflictual relationship to data.
Do you think Europe is dramatically further along on the path of protecting its citizens from all of this than we are here in North America?
I think they've made headway. I think that they have really tried to define the potential harms, what they're calling the risks in the EU AI Act, around technologies like AI. What I don't see as much movement on is to think more about how, potentially it's not just companies that are bad guys in this situation, as we talked about. Governments can also abuse citizen data. Governments can also use AI systems to discriminate or harm citizens as well. And so what I see coming out of Europe, on the one hand, is encouraging. I think the AI Act is great. The Digital Markets and Digital Services Act, which cover how big tech companies operate within Europe, is a step forward. However, the way that they think about data through the often, discussed General Data Regulation Act, General Data Protection Regulation, the GDPR, I think one of the issues is that the data have to be identifiable, right? In order to delete or port your data, which is an important set of rights in that legislation, you have to be able to find those data. Yet we know that a lot of times data become more useful not just at the point of collection, the initial stage, but you combine and merge different data sets together. So where does that go? What happens to the de-identified data that is not immediately traceable to a single individual, for example? How do we think about that? How do we regulate that? That is not possible under the current European model.
Well, let me bring the story home for a second. We don't have to tell anybody who lives in Northern Ontario or rural Ontario about the importance of not having this service when they want it. And we're spending, as taxpayers, hundreds of millions of dollars to try to bring broadband to places that don't have it. How do we ensure that those citizens have the same access to the service that people who live in the cities take for granted, while at the same time protecting their rights?
That's a tough one. On the one hand, I think you're absolutely right in speaking to the inequality in terms of accessing critical technologies like broadband internet or high-speed internet. So on the one hand, that's an equality issue, but it's a different kind of issue, as you point out, from the ones that I talk about in the book. So this is why I focus a lot on this idea of literacy in the book, thinking about how citizens and groups within society and governments should be creating policies around ensuring that citizens are literate in the digital age. Now, in the book, I talk about data literacy because I'm very focused on how data fundamentally change human life. But others talk about AI literacy or more broadly, digital literacy. The ideas are very similar in that right now, there are very few people who are experts on this stuff. They're the ones making the technologies and drawing the inferences from the vast pools of data they've collected. The rest of us are a mix of somewhat literate to, I would say, not literate or illiterate in digital technologies, which is in data, which is not to say that, that to cast any aspersions on people, but it is to say that our systems are not prepared to teach us about the implications, uses, and potential downfalls of having so much data about people. And also I would add the benefits, right? So it's not all negative, but I do think that we're sort of our ways of thinking about literacy and what it means to be competent and understand what's going on in society are locked into, the analog way to think about things, which is reading, writing, and arithmetic.
Even if data or data literacy is a right, most education begins for most people in the early years of life. So how do we ensure that all generations have access to data literacy?
Yeah, this, again, a big question. So a lot of people are working on the K through 12, right? Ensuring that kids are entering their adulthood and equipped for the rest of their lives with these skills. And I think that that's commendable and absolutely necessary. But most of us aren't kids. And so one way to deliver this kind of information, to sort of make data less scary to most people, I think there's a tendency to think data are numbers or math, which is true. But there are also ways to understand how data work, why data are created, how data themselves come into being. And that could be transmitted in my ideal world, policymakers would come to realize that we have institutions that have already passed on literacy skills quite effectively. These are public libraries. Public libraries are really well positioned. They're embedded in our communities. People use them all the time, not just for books and video, but also just to hang out. They're accessible. They're in all these different communities for the reason that they are accessible to the public. And I should add that librarians are uniquely positioned in our society because they are what I call the original data stewards. They're the ones who take all this information that humanity has created and create order around them, right? We can go to a library and find anything we want because librarians have gone through the task, perhaps sometimes thankless, of organizing all that information into coherent, accessible, and easily and readily available resources for the community.
Terrific. We want to thank Wendy H. Wong, the author of We the Data, or it could be We the Data. You say tomato and I say tomato. No, never mind. Let's call the whole thing off, Wendy, and thank you for coming on our program tonight. We're really grateful.
Oh, thanks, Steve. It was such a pleasure.
That is the agenda for Tuesday, May 20th, 2025. Tomorrow on the program, Steve Paikin and guests will look at the state of Ontario's college system, 60 years after its creation. I'm Jane Jaganathan. Thanks for watching TVO, for joining us online at tvo.org. And Steve, we'll see you again tomorrow.